Cinema. It's an inescapable art form. It has been at the forefront of popular culture and media for over the last 100 years. And over those years, it has done nothing but remain a part of many people's lives. But what really are films? How are they made? And what's the history behind them? Cinema and film weren't always like how we know it today. And in this video essay, I aim to explain how a little experiment turned into the billion-dollar industry we know it to be today. Before we get to here, we have to start at the beginning. In the 1800s. Cinema itself would be nowhere without the invention of celluloid in the 1800s. History would be made in 1878 when Edward Muybridge, who was an American-English photographer, was commissioned to take pictures of a horse in motion. He was commissioned to do so they could figure out whether all four horses' legs came off the ground during a race. He soon discovered that projecting each picture in quick succession would create a moving image. And this is widely acknowledged as the first ever moving picture. And as you can imagine, this got people interested. And for the next few years, people were playing around with what you could do with the moving image. And soon came the pioneering efforts of Thomas Edison and the Lumiere brothers. It wasn't until the early 20th century where films started to take a more narratively driven route. Films became more than just a sideshow attraction. They became a meaningful way of conveying a story. The filmmaking process was very hard though. Cameras had to be hand cranked. Editing involved the physical cutting of film. There was no sound and mostly no colour. At the time, the films were very simplistic. There were not a lot of cuts, not a lot of variation in shots. Also, at the same time, French filmmaker Georges Méliès was pioneering special effects as we know it. He is known as the father of special effects and produced one-shot film, accidentally discovering stop action for himself. Soon using stop action, double exposure, fast and slow motion, dissolves and perspective tricks. Essentially what we know now as a jump cut, aligning two identical shots but with different items in the frame. Georges Méliès was also known for his famous 1902 film called Trip to the Moon. He used perspective tricks and shifts to tell the story of Victorian explorers visiting the moon. He had a 10-year run as the best-known filmmaker in the world, but was surpassed by others such as D.W. Griffith and bankrupted in World War I. This all changed in the 1920s when Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein came out with his theory for the 5 methods of montage. It was his firm belief that film editing techniques could shape the narrative much more than just acting on screen. A combination of complex and different shots can create more complex ideas than their content within the shot itself. Along with this was the Kuleshov effect, no longer just using wide shots with actors putting on over-the-top performances, instead intersecting mixes of shots. For example, The Expressionless Man intersected with the images of a soup, pretty woman, and dead girl, all of which evoke different emotional responses with the audiences. All films during the early 1900s were all in black and white, until 1917 where an attempt was made by American scientists and filmmakers to create a feature-length colour film. The Gulf Between was meant to be a proof of concept, proof that this whole Technicolor experiment was commercially viable, and at the time it wasn't, as people were complaining that there was too many flashes of bright light, too many greens and bright reds, and did not look pleasing to the eye. It is not actually agreed upon when the first full-colour film was released, but most people like to say that it was The Wizard of Oz, which may not be true, but it certainly revolutionised the way we watched films. Moving on, in 1927, the first ever film with synced sound, music and special effects was 1927's The Jazz Singer. It was the first ever feature-length motion picture to do this. And with this invention, filming was pushed into sound stages and studios rather than filming on site. This revolutionised filmmaking forever. Silent films died out as audiences expected sound to be in their films. And it was after this, MGM, Paramount, RKO, Warner Brothers and 20th Century Fox began to mass-produce films. During the golden age of Hollywood, from the 1930s to 1960s, 90 million Americans per week went to go watch a film, and 400 movies were being produced each year. These studios had a monopoly on the film market and would have special deals with different cinemas prioritising their films instead of others, leaving independent filmmakers by the wayside. From the 1950s to the 1970s, filmmaking underwent a few major changes. Seeing as this was the 1950s, this was at the start of the Cold War, and a lot of films at the time were funded by the government with messages that warned about the evils of communism.
If you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
And how they would take over. This was known as the Red Scare, and this was all headed by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who said there were communists all around us. This created fear within audiences that there was going to be an invasion. In no film is this better represented than in 1957's Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Such theories like Alfred Hitchcock's colour theory started to become more prevalent in films as colour could be used as a narrative device. And it was during this time where filmmakers got creative with their special effects. 1963's Jason and the Argonauts was a film created by Ray Harryhausen, often cited as one of the pioneers of special effects in films. He used a combination of stop motion and live action by choreographing and lining up two identical shots to put mythical beasts fighting human beings in his films. Of course, this had been done before in 1933's King Kong, but not to this kind of level. His films filled audiences with wonder and would mesmerise them for a couple of hours. It was also during this time that blue screens were being used, but not in the way that we use green screens today. In Star Wars in 1977, George Lucas hired what was now known as ILM, a group of visual technicians who had to create new technologies in order to fulfill George Lucas's dreams. They would film objects on a blue screen and could later cut them out and add different backgrounds because they filmed with a double or triple exposure. And like Charlie Chaplin's films, they would use physical projection mapping, painting on a pane of glass and lining up the shot. Although a difficult process, it turned out looking great on film. It in fact looked so good that this was now what audiences came to expect from big blockbuster films. ILM, also known as Industrial Light and Magic, became a sought-after effects company in the years to come, working on all of George Lucas's future projects. Also working on Star Trek 2 and 3, Young Sherlock Holmes, Labyrinth, Star Trek 4, Spaceballs, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Last Temptation of Christ, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Ghostbusters 2 and Back to the Future Part 2. And this was just in the 80s alone. Digital editing was not available until 1985 when a company called Quantel released the Harry. The Harry was the first ever all-digital video editing and effects compositing system, but due to technical limitations it could only record and apply effects to a maximum of 80 seconds of 8-bit uncompressed digital video. And it wasn't until 1987 when Avid Technology created the Avid/1 Media Composer. It was designed using the Apple Macintosh 2 computer platform. It was a revolutionary design. It was not the first NLE that used modern concepts like clip bins and timeline editing. These were introduced with Lucasfilm's Edit Droid, a computerized analog NLE from the early 1980s. And in 1989, Avid Technology publicly introduced the Avid/1 Media Composer. The movie making procedures stayed relatively similar until the late 90s, when in 1995 the first ever digitally 3D animated film Toy Story was released. Also during this time, filmmakers were experimenting with CGI characters in live action films. Movies like the first Jurassic Park and Titanic used CGI for things they could not capture on film without wasting the budget, but they do use it sparingly however. CGI became far more prevalent in the early 2000s with films such as Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars prequels, both relying heavily on CGI environments and characters. And ever since those movies came out, CGI has become one of the most popular and reoccurring things in modern cinema. Audiences have come to expect it and now get practical effects mixed up with special effects, seeing as it has become so realistic in recent years. Also in recent years, prices of digital cameras and editing software has made filmmaking more accessible to independent filmmakers and special effects editors. Nowadays, filmmakers can just upload their movies to YouTube and other platforms that can help them monetize their films without having a mainstream release. Also, social media and video sharing platforms allow for filmmakers and companies to advertise their films in a way that was not possible before and reach a targeted demographic. I hope you enjoyed watching. This was 100 years of cinema and the history of it. Thank you for watching.